Hello, my name is Jim Gurman and welcome to today's episode of
Kilimanjaro.
Today we're going to be taking a look at the Grizzly G0490X 8-inch parallelogram bed joiner. So the 8-inch is pretty easy to know. It's the width of the joiner, the width of the cutter head that's on the joiner. The parallelogram bed, though, means the way the beds move in relation to the cutter head. On a parallelogram bed joiner, there's a linkage between this point here, and a linkage between this point here and up here. And the bed makes a parallelogram between those two linkages in the bottom, and as you adjust it, it goes up and down like this. Now that's supposed to keep the edge of the bed a little bit closer to the cutter head compared to a dovetail joiner. A dovetail joiner has a dovetail going this way and this way that the two beds ride on, and the bed slides on that as you adjust it. In practice, both methods work pretty much the same. The parallelogram bed joiner is a couple dollars more expensive, maybe $50 more expensive, but it also has a slightly bigger bed and a slightly bigger base, so there's that to consider as well. The X in the model name designates that this joiner has the spiral cutter head. So if I take the guard off, which I've already unbolted, you can see that instead of having a typical arrangement of high-speed steel straight knives going across the top of it, this cutter has an arrangement of carbide inserts arranged in a spiral going around the cutter head. So there's a number of different benefits because of this. The first is that the carbide inserts are much harder and will stay a lot sharper than the high-speed steel inserts. The other benefit is that if you get a nick in one of these cutter heads, the whole thing hasn't gotten dull. You've just nicked one because there was a nail or a staple or something in your piece of wood. You can just take that insert out, turn it by 90 degrees, put it back in, and you have a brand new sharp cutter head to put in here. Of course, the downside to this is you can't sharpen these inserts. You have to replace them. But each one has four cutting surfaces on each insert, and they're not that expensive. One of the other benefits of these cutter heads, because they are spiraled and the whole cutter head isn't hitting the piece of wood at once, they're significantly quieter than a straight blade cutter head. The last benefit is that with these cutter heads, they are supposed to do much better with highly grained wood, highly figured wood, something like bird's eye maple, something like that has a lot of curvy grain going through it. Theoretically, you should get a lot less tear out with a cutter head like that. I quite like this cutter head, however, there is a downside to it, and that's when it is time to change the blades, it is a much more lengthy process. There's about 40 of these little inserts that you have to take out each individually, and each one needs to be reset perfectly. There can't be any dust underneath each one, or that cutter will be a little bit higher than the rest, and you won't get a smooth cut. It can be a bit of a pain to take these all out, make sure they're all perfect, and put them back in place. So let's talk for a minute about what a joiner actually does. So the first thing that a joiner does is it will make one face perfectly flat. The next thing that it can do is make one face at a particular angle to the other face. So typically that's 90 degrees. So typically you would hold your board up against the fence, tight up against the fence, slide it over the cutter head, and that'll make this edge 90 degrees perfectly perpendicular to this face. So why is that important? If you get a rough board from the lumberyard, none of the faces will be parallel, perpendicular, it'll just be a mess. It might be pretty close, but it won't be perfect. So the first thing that you would do is take the board, lay it flat, and drive it over your cutter head. That'll make this face perfectly flat. Then what you can do is take that face that you've just milled, put that against your fence, you know that that's perfectly flat, you run this over this way, and you get a face here that's perfectly perpendicular to this face and perfectly flat. Then to get your other board, your other edge perfectly flat, you would cut it on a table saw, rip that off, that makes this perpendicular to this, and then lastly you'd run it through a thickness planer, which would make it whatever thickness you want and make this face parallel to this face. So then you have a board that is perfectly square and perfectly flat, in theory at least. So some of the things that can be very beneficial is to have a very large joiner. So this is an 8-inch joiner, it's about mid-range in the class. And I really like it for two reasons. The first is 8-inch boards are pretty typical. If you start going much above 8-inch boards, most lumber yards will charge you a premium for that, and they're much more harder to come by. So sometimes, yes, it is nicer to have a bigger joiner, but the price also starts to get dramatically more expensive as you go up beyond this class of joiner. The other thing that's really nice about it is it has a much longer bed in both directions. Now if you've got a long board, if it's hanging off there with 8 feet hanging off the bed, it can be very difficult to keep it perfectly flat on here as you move it across the fence. The longer this table is, the more support you have, the longer a board you can do, the more control you're going to have. It's the same thing with the fence. The taller the fence, if you've got a wide board, you don't have to worry about it rocking this way as much. So that's one of the reasons I really like an 8-inch joiner, and the length of the joiner and the size of the fence can be very important. This joiner has a 3 horsepower motor and can take it up to a 1/2 inch depth of cut. That's much deeper than I've ever wanted to go in a joiner, and whenever I've needed to, it has cut everything with no bogging down, no power issues whatsoever. You can also attach a dust collector to this. There's a 4-inch port over here. If you don't have a dust collector, you can take that little shroud off and the chips will just slide right down. It does work much better with the dust collector. For one thing, it doesn't make as big a mess. The other thing, without the dust collector, the chips tend to blow back a little bit and get caught and recut, making for somewhat less smooth of a cut. So you adjust the height of this joiner by first tilting that lever down, and then you can use this handle to move it up and down. So one thing I really don't like about this joiner is the scale here. So this scale goes from 0 to a 1/2 inch. There's a little couple gradations along it, but it's not real clear how it is, and if you're looking like this or you're looking like this, it's not real obvious how deep a cut you're going to make. It's not usually an issue. Usually I'm just like, I want a little deeper cut or a little shallower cut. You can always make a test cut and measure how deep it cut. But it is something that I don't really like about this joiner. One of the things I used to like a lot about this joiner was that it was on wheels. So over here there's a little foot pedal. You push that down and you could roll it around really easily. However, I needed to raise my joiner up to clear my table saw. I think you can just barely see at the bottom of the frame here that I've got it on blocks now, so I can't use that. When it was down on the wheels though, really like that. Worked great for moving it in and out if I needed a little more space or to adjust the joiner if there was something in the way of it. The joiner also came with these 2 push blocks, which I thought were pretty crappy when I first used them, but they actually work really well. They're a nice design. The rubber on them has held up really well. It's nice and grippy. And they actually feel pretty nice in the hand. So these I was surprisingly pleased with. They also happen to fit nicely right up there where they're always within reach. So the fence on the joiner can slide in and out. There's a lever back here, and then it slides in and out. Doesn't feel great when it slides, but it has never been a problem, and it's not something you adjust terribly often. You can also adjust this lever and then rotate the fence if you wanted to make an angle cut. That's not something I've ever done. Most of the time whenever I need to adjust this, it's just to fiddle with it because it's become not perfectly square with this bottom fence. That's pretty easy to do too. There's a stop here and you just get a square and measure it up so it's nice and square with your table here. The rest of the joiner is also pretty easy to adjust. There's a couple eccentric cams here and here that you can use to dial it in just nicely. So the question with Grizzly is always, how good is the quality of the product? Obviously it's at the lower end of the price scale and it's made in China. However, I'm very happy with the quality of this joiner. The tables are all nicely ground. They're very nice and flat. The fence is very nicely ground. And in general, the castings are nice and big and beefy. On the other end, however, the castings, nobody broke any edges on them, so they're a little sharp. I had to file those myself. This sheet metal down here got dented a little when shipping. Hasn't held up super well. Could be a little bit higher gauge. This post here that the controls attached to, super solid, very nice. Most of the controls, these handles here, this handle here, are metal. They feel pretty good. However, some of them are super chintzy. This plastic on this handle here, it's got to be the cheapest plastic you could ever get. I really wish they'd spend a couple more nickels on a little bit nicer of a handle here. That's the same with the one that you use under here to adjust the height of the table. They also all tend to wobble a little bit. You can't really tighten them up nice and tight, so it just doesn't feel great. It doesn't really affect how it works, but it doesn't feel great. I am very happy with how the guard works. It closes nicely. You can adjust the tension on the spring if you want. It gets out of your way when you need it to, and it's a good height, and it's nice for head. The other question is longevity. So I've had this joiner for close to 10 years now. I've had 2 things break on it. First is this little plastic switch. Sometimes when you go to turn it, it slips. It's not super annoying. I could probably get it replaced pretty easily if I wanted to, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. And the other thing is the capacitor on the motor. So the starting capacitor on the motor blew on this joiner. Fortunately, starting capacitors are very commonly available and not super expensive. They do tend to break from time to time. So I was able to go to Grainger and get a replacement the same day. McMaster-Carr also has plenty of starting capacitors. You could also get one from Grizzly if you wanted the exact right part, but were willing to wait another day or 2. So I did notice that the capacitor I replaced it with was a significantly physically larger capacitor, even though it had the same rating. So maybe the one that it came with wasn't as good of a quality. The one I replaced it with was still made in China though, so take from that what you will. Alright, I'm going to start up the joiner now. I'm going to get my safety glasses. I'm not going to use any dust collection, so you can just hear the joiner as it is. I'm going to use these nice push blocks, and I'll make a cut across the face. I'm not going to make a terribly deep cut. probably deeper than you would usually go for the face of it. It's probably set to about a 1/16 of an inch or so. Got to plug it in. So I had it unplugged when I was taking the guard off. Alright, so you can see it does take a couple minutes to spin down, not super big deal. You won't be able to tell how good a cut quality it is from this distance, but it is very nicely done. There aren't any marks on it. Sometimes with the cutter heads like this, you can see the individual cutter heads in a pattern. Have noticed if you cut something that is like end grain or something like that, not really sure why you would do that, sometimes you can just barely see that. And it's significantly quieter than a joiner that uses straight blades. So where does that leave us? Well, this joiner retails for about $1,400. On the lower end, below this, you could go to a 6-inch joiner, but I think this really hits the sweet spot of size and cost. You go up to a 10 or 12-inch joiner, you're talking a lot more money, and it takes up a lot more rooms, a lot heavier, a lot more difficult to deal with. You go on the 6-inch joiner, the bed gets shorter, gets narrower, you're probably not going to be able to deal with it as many boards. I think this really hits the sweet spot on the size range. Now you can get a more expensive one, something like a Powermatic, still going to be made in Asia. The castings on it are probably a little higher quality. The handles are certainly going to be a higher quality, but probably doesn't cut any better. And the surface that you run the boards on probably isn't going to be any more nicely ground than this. So in the end, I think this really hits the sweet spot in terms of price and quality, and I think it's a great joiner for you to get. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'd love to see you subscribe, and thanks for watching.